What's happening, everybody? We got another UFC card this weekend, headlined by Robert Whittaker taking on Aliskerov. As you're watching this video, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're going to be breaking down all of the fights this weekend and helping prepare you with the information you need to make some money over on DraftKings. I'm using the Stochastic Sims tool here. I simmed out the entire slate. I've got my top lineups favorited. If you want to sign up for this tool, sign up using the link below in the description box. Also, for a giveaway, we did one last week. It was how many underdogs would end up winning on the card. The correct answer was 4. A handful of people in the YouTube comments got the answer correct. The winner of the giveaway, it is Mind Freak. That is Mind spelled with a Y, and then he also spelled Freak with 2 Ks on the end. You win 1 free subscription to our Odd Shopper. That is our betting site. If you want to claim that, DM me on Twitter. I'll show you over a link and a promo code to get you set up with a free subscription. Giveaway for this week. Let me know in the comment section, number 1, who wins the main event this weekend between Robert Whittaker and Aliskerov, and then also, how many fantasy points does that winner score? Whoever's closest to the correct answer, you're going to win yourself a free subscription to Odd Shopper. But let's start breaking down the card because I know that's what you guys are here for, and we're going to start with the main event. That is Robert Whittaker taking on Aliskerov, and I'm not sure why I had a random fight selected there, but it doesn't matter. I'm on the main event right now. So I have just one bet that I've placed for this card so far, and it is Robert Whittaker minus 135 on the money line. So I did beat some line value there. The current line is anywhere from like minus 150 to minus 160. I still think that the minus 150 on Robert Whittaker is playable. Going to walk it through with you guys now why I am on the Robert Whittaker side. And there is also some narratives to this fight, which I'm sure you guys are all aware of. Aliskerov, he was supposed to be taking on Anthony Troli last week. It was a very odd fight that didn't really make a whole lot of sense from a matchmaking perspective. And then as soon as Chimaev ended up pulling out of this week's card, Ikram got moved onto this week's card. Actually, so did Troli as well, because he's going to be fighting against Shara Bullet. We'll talk about that fight in a little bit. But the biggest thing to me here is all of the unknowns that we have about Aliskerov. And I had said a lot of the same stuff last week when it came to the main event against Alex Perez taking on Tetsuro Taira. And even though Taira ended up winning, there were some still like really weird circumstances around that win where I still did feel good about my bet on Alex Perez. Perez won the first round and then was something like, like a minus 150, minus 200 favorite on the live line in the second round at the time that he blew his knee out. So I do have a lot of the same concerns about Aliskerov that I had about Taira last week, namely being that we've never seen Ikram in a 5-round fight. We're not sure how he's going to look in an extended fight. And there's also just a lot of question marks about his game in general. If you look at the fights that we've seen out of Aliskerov so far, either in the UFC or on the Contender Series. So on the Contender Series, he does win by Kimura against Mario Souza. However, that was a fight where I thought Souza was winning the striking until Aliskerov was able to get the takedown, was able to get top position, and then to his credit, got the submission very easily and very quickly shortly after he ended up getting top position, but he was getting outstruck by Souza prior to that. Kind of a similar thing against Phil Hawes. I thought Phil Hawes was outstriking Aliskerov, but what ends up happening? Phil Hawes is negative durability. He ends up getting hit clean on the chin and just goes out 100% totally cold. But I thought that Phil Hawes was winning the striking exchanges up until the point he got knocked out. And then the fight against Warlley Alves, fair play to Ikram. He just ran through Warlley Alves, but Warlley Alves is somebody who's like a very low-level UFC fighter at this point in his career. So this is such a crazy step up in competition for Aliskerov. And when you consider some of the guys that I think have outstruck Aliskerov to this point in his UFC career, I have to think that Whittaker is going to have a massive striking advantage here. Now, grappling, that certainly goes to Ikram, but Whittaker is very, very good takedown defense. This has kind of always been his calling card. We've seen these sorts of matchups for Robert Whittaker throughout his career where he's fought against fighters that were really good grapplers, and he has an 82% career takedown defense. He's typically been able to keep the fights on the feet, hurt his opponents, and then put them away. That was what had Robert Whittaker rising up through the ranks, become a contender, and ultimately become the champion of this weight class division. So I think there's a massive ceiling for Aliskerov. It's just a very tight line for a guy who we have so many questions about that we just don't know the answers to. And he legitimately might only have 1 round of cardio. We've never seen him extended at all. So I have to be on the Whittaker side. If Ikram wins, he's almost certainly going to score well. It's probably going to be either because he knocks out Robert Whittaker in the first round. Whittaker does get hurt at times in a lot of his fights, his durability is a question at this point in his career, or Ikram's able to land takedowns. He's able to hold top control. So I'm not going to totally write off Ikram from a DFS standpoint, but I've placed a bet on Robert Whittaker on the money line. He's in 70% of my lineups. And on the other side, I have Ikram in about 30% of my lineups. So that's the way I'm looking to divvy up my exposures to this fight, but a main event that I'm all in on. The co-main event. If we're looking at the co-main event, we have the return of Sergey Pavlich coming off of his interim championship belt loss against Tom Aspinall, taking on Alexander Volkov. And there is a path to beating Pavlich in a lot of his matchups. And, it's heavyweight, so there's always variance. Anybody can get knocked out at any point in time. But Pavlich has a massive, massive glaring hole on the ground. He has poor takedown defense, and then he doesn't really have the ability to get up once he's taken down. That was what I thought was going to be the easiest path to victory for Tom Aspinall, but instead Aspinall just knocked him out in about a minute and then never ended up coming into play. But if you look at the first loss that we saw out of Sergey Pavlich in the UFC, it came in a fight against Alistair Overeem, and what happened was Overeem fighting Pavlich. Overeem just landed one takedown. Pavlich got stuck underneath him and just got ground and pounded until he got finished. The problem here is that when fights take place on the feet with Pavlich, he is so powerful, and all it takes is one shot for him to hurt and knock somebody out. And as on the Volkov side, while he is a pretty good striker, and I think he's probably going to have more output in this fight, I know that technically also Pavlich somehow has a 4-inch reach advantage over Volkov, but I do think that Volkov is going to be able to utilize teep kicks and his kicks to keep Pavlich at range at times. The problem is going to be, though, that Volkov does not have the kind of power that somebody like Tom Aspinall has. He also doesn't have the ability to wrestle to be able to get top position against Sergey Pavlich. So what I think is going to happen is Volkov could win a lot of the striking exchanges at times, but at a certain point, I think Pavlich is going to land a big shot, probably in the first round, and knock out Alexander Volkov. So Sergey Pavlich, he is one of my favorite pay-up options on the slate. He is currently in about half of my lineups at the time that I'm recording this video. Kelvin Gastelum taking on D-Rod, Daniel Rodriguez, and what a disaster on the Gastelum side. Gastelum didn't fight well in his return to 170 pounds against Sean Brady. If you look at the stats here, he was taken down 5 times. Sean Brady also had, 9 minutes of control time before getting the third round finish. So Kelvin Gastelum, from a competitive standpoint, didn't look great in that fight, but he looked good physically. He looked like he belonged at the 170-pound weight class. He was in shape. There was reasons to be optimistic about the future of Kelvin Gastelum's career coming out of that fight. That all goes by the wayside this week because he's booked to fight Daniel Rodriguez at 170 pounds for this fight. And Kelvin Gastelum ends up saying, I'm not going to be able to make 170 pounds. So what happens is Daniel Rodriguez proposes, let's do a catch weight. And he proposes 180 pounds, according to Daniel Rodriguez. And Gastelum says, I'm not going to be able to make 180 pounds. This was a fight that was signed for 170 pounds. Gastelum says he can't even make 180 pounds. So they end up fighting at 185 pounds. I just don't know what kind of condition Kelvin Gastelum is coming in right now. If he wasn't able to make within 10 pounds of the weight class, that is a pretty telling sign that he's either dealing with an injury or he just did not have a very effective training camp to be able to get into shape for this fight. And then on the D-Rod side, he's somebody who looks super washed at this point in his career. He has not looked great in his recent fights. His last couple outings against Ian Machado Gary, and I know that Gary's like a pretty hyped prospect and he was a big favorite, but D-Rod looked terrible. He looked slow. He got hurt pretty much immediately in that fight and ends up getting knocked out in just a few minutes. And then also, he was not all that competitive against Neil Magny. So you really have to go all the way back to the fight against Kevin Lee where D-Rod looked okay, and that's 3 years ago now at this point. He was also at a massive size advantage over Kevin Lee. So I just don't know what to make of either side of this fight. I'm hoping there's not a knockout. I'm not going to be very high on this for DFS. If I had to play one side, I guess it would be D-Rod just because he is cheaper. So he's more likely to be in the optimal lineup in a win. But I just have no faith in Kelvin Gastelum. And traditionally also, neither D-Rod nor Kelvin Gastelum fights score especially well for DraftKings because neither of them are potent finishers. So I don't have all that much interest in this fight. If I had to play one side, it's going to be D-Rod. But I mean, my current set of lineups, I have D-Rod in 14% of lineups and Gastelum in 8%. So I'll be underweight to this fight and just hoping that nobody puts up a massive score. Sharabulat Magomedov taking on Antonio Tricoli. And this is another really weird fight. So if you guys saw the UFC debut of Sharabulat, he He takes on Bruno Silva. The striking looked great. But what do we end up finding out in that fight is that Magomedov, for a guy whose last name is Magomedov, you've never seen worse defensive wrestling and grappling in your entire life. It looked like he had never been on his back in his entire life. Looked like he had never defended a takedown before. So what ends up happening is Magomedov nearly gets a finish in the first round against Bruno Silva. He is brutalizing him. A wide variety of strikes, a lot of powerful kicks. And Bruno Silva is able to survive. We get into the later rounds. It ends up being, even though it was 30-27 on all three judges' scorecards, it was more competitive than that. And I did think that Bruno Silva won the third round of that fight. It's because if you look at some of the stats here, third round, Bruno Silva lands a couple of takedowns. He also has 4 minutes of control time. So he was on top of Magomedov for nearly the entire third round of that bout. And in the second round, too, we ended up seeing him 2.5 minutes of control time, lands a takedown. It's not to say Bruno Silva should have won the fight. What I'm trying to say is that Magomedov clearly has a glaring hole in his game. We just don't know that Troli is going to be the one who's able to exploit that, particularly because Troli has fought once in the last 5 years. So it's really hard to know what we're getting out of the Troli side. He not only hasn't fought in 5 years, he also had a PED suspension, so we don't know what he looks like coming back from that. All kinds of question marks. If he's somehow able to land takedowns in this fight, then he might look live in this spot. Because it's a short card, I'm willing to take some underdog shots on Antonio Troli. But the real side of this for me, it is going to be Magomedov. He's a play that I'm really high on the upper end of the pricing range in 57% of my lineup. So him and Pavich, my two most rostered pay up options, same as what the field is doing, but I think it's very much warranted in this spot. All the time off for Troli. He might just look like a total can. So outside of playing a bunch of lineups and taking some underdog shots on Troli, I have to go with Magomedov, and I think he probably wins by KO as well. He's going to be a fade in the future, Magomedov. I just don't know if this is the spot for it. Johnny Walker against Volkan Oezdemir. And I'll be honest with you guys, this is a really, really hard fight to know what to make of for DFS purposes, because this applies to both the Volkan Oezdemir and the Johnny Walker side. Sometimes these guys come out really aggressive and they have really fun, exciting fights. It scores really well for DraftKings. Somebody gets a first or second round finish. There's knockdowns involved, takedowns, just a big score comes about. But other times, and once again, this goes to both Johnny Walker and Volkan Oezdemir, they could have other fights that are just total stinkers where neither of them do much, their opponents don't do much, and then the winner ends up scoring like 65 fantasy points in a decision win. So here's how I'm going to play this fight for DraftKings purposes. Whatever the field ends up doing, I'm going to try to align my exposures with the field because I recognize there's upside on both the Oezdemir and Walker side of this fight, while also being a lot of downside where somebody could get knocked out early, or it could just be a really shitty fight that is not entertaining and scores really poorly for DraftKings. So here's our current projected ownership. We've got Oezdemir project for 31% ownership. I have him in 31% of my lineups. Johnny Walker's project for 30% ownership. I have him in 32% of my lineups. That's what I'm going to try to do with our Sims tool. There's such a wide variety of outcomes with this fight that could go positive or negative in either way. And I also think this fight is a total coin flip. I'll just align myself with the field. I'll try to get different elsewhere. The next fight that we have to talk about on the card, it is Nasrat Haqparast against Jared Gordon. I like Haqparast in this spot. I think he's also very live for a knockout. He is considerably younger than Jared Gordon. He's got there's a 7-year age gap between them. And then also on top of that, Haqparast is a very good striker who has a lot more power than people realize. So the reason, which I mean kind of makes sense, that people don't really think of him as much of a finisher is because he doesn't have very many finish wins in the UFC. But here's something that always stood out to me about Haqparast as he was coming up into the UFC and why he was once regarded as a pretty high-end prospect. His UFC debut, he fights against Marcin Held. He does lose a decision in that fight, but he lands a knockdown. His next fight in the UFC, his first win, it's against Mark Chikasi. He wins a decision, also lands a knockdown. His next fight against Thibaut Galti, wins a decision, no finish, but also lands a knockdown. His fight against Joaquim Silva, does get the finish in that fight, lands a knockdown, obviously the knockdown and the knockout in that spot. The point I'm getting at here, though, is Haqparast, even if he isn't always getting finishes in a lot of these fights, we have seen that he has the power to put guys on their ass. That is something that ultimately is kind of predictive to landing finishes later on in his career. And we did see that in his last fight against Jamie Mullarkey. Fight only took what was, you see right here, it was less than 2 minutes. Haqparast lands 2 knockdowns and gets a finish in just a couple of minutes in that fight. And then also see another one here against John McDessie where Haqparast ended up getting a decision win, but also landed a knockdown in that fight. So he's landing knockdowns in something like half of the fights that he's been in. And that is something that lends itself well to eventually putting guys away. And Jared Gordon is a fighter who we've seen knocked out numerous times. Jared Gordon was knocked out. I know this technically didn't count as a knockout because it was ruled a no contest, but he got knocked out by Bobby Green. We also saw Jared Gordon get knocked out by Charles Oliveira. We saw him get knocked out by Joaquim Silva. We saw him get knocked out by Diego Ferreira. That is a handful of times for a guy to be knocked out. And now also Jared Gordon being at an older age. Haqparast, the better athlete. He's going to be much faster of the two. I think Haqparast is live for a knockout. If you're looking to pay up for a fighter and be a little bit different from the field, I think Haqparast is a good way to go. He's only projected for 25% ownership. I've got him in 34% of my lineups. I'm picking him to win. I think he's much more live for a knockout than the field realizes. I'm also considering betting the KO prop on Nasrat Haqparast. It's a way on a small slate that you could give yourself some upside and also build a lineup that's different where the field is going. Next up, we have Muhammad Naimov taking on Felipe Lima. There's a lot of fighters on this card that have kind of had weird starts to their UFC career. Naimov is another one. So we saw Naimov lose on the Contender Series and did not look like he belonged anywhere near the UFC when he lost that fight. And then somehow he ends up getting a late notice fight against Jamie Mullarkey. And Mullarkey destroys Naimov in the first round. It is not competitive at all. And then Naimov gets a flash knockout in the second round of that fight. And it's like, all right, he took the fight on late notice. He's not somebody who really looked like he belonged in the UFC when he fought on the Contender Series. He lost on the Contender Series. And so I was thinking, like, Naimov, not somebody who I'm considering a real legitimate prospect. Then he goes and fights against Nathaniel Wood. And it's another really weird fight and one where not that much output from a fantasy standpoint. 48 significant strikes landed by Naimov, 50 by Nathaniel Wood. But Naimov did look like the better fighter in that fight. With that said, he was committing numerous fouls, multiple fence grabs. There was eye pokes. There was groin strikes in that fight. So it's like, all right, Naimov won. He looked impressive, especially relative to his other appearances we'd seen him in the octagon, to get a win over Nathaniel Wood. So then it's kind of like, all right, I don't know exactly what to make of Naimov. And then he's fighting against Eric Silva. And it's like, who is he? Is he the guy who looked terrible against Colin Anglin and Jamie Mullarkey? Is he the guy who looked good against Nathaniel Wood? And then what happens? He fights against Eric Silva, and Eric Silva just blows out his knee in non-contact injury 40 seconds into the fight, backing up against the octagon. So Naimov lands one strike. He goes for one takedown attempt, and we see Silva blow out his knee on a non-contact injury. So once again, we just didn't get that much information out of him. So I don't really know where Naimov is at. And I don't want to seem like I'm sitting on the fence with a lot of these fights, but I'm just kind of being honest with you guys how I'm seeing some of these spots. And there are a lot of fighters like Aliskerov in the main event who, how can we know if he could fight 5 rounds or not? I do feel at the very least that Naimov is more proven than Lima. And I also feel pretty decent about how good he looked over Nathaniel Wood and how much he was improved over his last couple of fights. So I'm picking Naimov to win. But one thing that does really stand out about this fight is that I do think that it's pretty likely to go to the judges' scorecards. It's also how it's priced in the betting market. It's right around, I think, minus 180 to go to the judges' scorecards. So I don't think this is a fight that we need to have all that much exposure to. I have Naimov in 20% of lineups. I have Lima in 18%. So I'm underweight to both sides. That's the way that I'm looking at playing this fight. I don't think the winner should score especially well relative to some of the other spots we have to target on the slate. Not a fade, but one that I'm going to be underweight to. Hinat Fakhretdinov taking on Nicholas Dalby. I really like this spot for Fakhretdinov. The only issue I have with him is that I prefer some other spend-up options. But Fakhretdinov lands 4.25 takedowns per 15 minutes, and Dalby does not have the best takedown defense, only defending takedowns at a 60% clip. There are also some cardio concerns with Fakhretdinov. If you guys watched his last fight against Elizeu Gillespie dos Santos, Fakhretdinov looked great in the first couple rounds of the fight, and then the wheels totally fell off. He ends up getting 10-8'd in the final round, and that's why the fight ends up being a draw there. But I think this is a much easier matchup for him against Nicholas Dalby. There is maybe some concern that he gets fatigued late in this fight again, but Dalby's not exactly a potent finisher. So Fakhretdinov, pick him to win by decision, and it should be grappling and wrestling based, which would score relatively well. So I have him in 36% of my lineups. It is a little bit overweight to the field, but I do prefer paying up for Magomedov or Pavich for this weekend's card. Really, the only knock against Fakhretdinov is that there's other fighters that I think have even more upside. Next fight that we have here, it is Kang against Muin Gafarov, and Gafarov's been very unimpressive to this point in his career. His last fight, it was a very, very difficult matchup. They put him in there against Saeed Nurmagomedov, which was kind of an odd booking when you consider that he already had losses to Chen and Helliger on the Contender Series and then also lost to John Castaneda in his UFC debut. With that said, it kind of makes it odd to me that Gafarov is a somewhat significant betting favorite over Kang in this matchup, because Kang, while he is an older fighter who you can't feel great about the fact that he's closer to 40 than he is to 30. And then he's also somebody who, we kind of know we're getting out of Kang. A little bit of power. He's somebody who's capable of wrestling. He can hold some top control, but not the best minute winner in the world. You do see that he is fairly low output, only lands 3.35 significant strikes per minute. On the Gafarov side, he only lands 2.98 significant strikes per minute. I think this is a very close fight, close to a pick'em in my opinion. With that being the case, I'd rather be on the Kang side. There aren't that many underdogs I feel great about this weekend. So I'll take shots on Kang just because he's the cheaper fighter. It should be a competitive fight, but also not a spot that I think we really need to be targeting for this weekend's card. I've got Kang in 27% of my lineup. So some exposure, nothing too crazy, but he's certainly a viable underdog. I'm not going to be paying up for Gafarov all that frequently. A couple of fights left here to talk about. Magomed Gazisulov, I did my best, taking on Bredson Rivero. And Gazisulov is, let's see, what's his projected ownership? We have him at 35% projected ownership. He should win this fight by finish. Ribeiro is not somebody who has poor skills, but he does have very poor durability. So we've seen Ribeiro hurt and finished a handful of times throughout his career. As a result of that, you've got Gazisulov as a pretty big favorite and also a fight that is very likely to finish inside the distance. Pulling up the most recent betting odds here. This fight is now, every time I look, I feel like it goes down a little bit. This fight is minus 200 to finish under 1.5 rounds. So with that being the case, Gazisulov is certainly somebody who possesses a lot of upside. I have him in 32% of my lineups, about in line with the field, slightly underweight. The only real issue, once again, it's kind of like what I said about Fakhretdinov, and I have somewhat similar exposures to him and Fakhretdinov, is my preference is to pay up for Pavich or Bullet Magomedov. So with that being the case, Gazisulov, certainly somebody to have in your player pool and somebody to have in a good chunk of lineups. I'm just not going crazy overweight to him in the way that I'm targeting some of the other pay-up options. Final fight to talk about on the card, it is Xiao Long against Chang Ho Lee. And this is pretty simple to me from just an odds and value perspective. It's a very close fight. There is a little bit of line movement now towards Chang Ho Lee. So as a result, when the fight card first came out and the DraftKings prices were put out, Long was, I think he was a minus 130 favorite at the time. And then Chang Ho Lee was right around even money. And then the line flipped. So now you've got Chang Ho Lee, who is $7,900 and is a slight favorite to win a very competitive fight. Give me the salary savings on Chang Ho Lee. It should be a competitive fight. I'm not convinced the winner scores especially well, but because this is a card where it's a small card, it's hard to find live underdogs. And at the very least, these two do fight fairly aggressively, and it's also a low-level fight. I think that we could end up seeing this fight score okay. And then it's $7,900 a win for Lee. Could be good enough to land in an optimal lineup. If you look at his numbers so far, and once again, really small sample size, we've seen him fight twice, and this was on road to the UFC stuff. But 4.3 takedowns landed per 15 minutes, also 4.3 significant strikes landed per minute. So I do have some hope that this could be a pretty fun fight in the mid-range. Both fighters warrant a little bit of exposure, but I'm going to be more on the Chang Ho Lee side for the cheaper price as well as the value on DraftKings when it comes to relative to the betting market. That is going to do it for me. I'll go back to my lineups here so you guys could just see my exposures as I sign off here. If you haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for any of the MMA packages we have at Stochastic, use the link below in the description box. You want to sign up for our Sims tool, you could build all your lineups on our site, and then you could also simulate them all using our Sims. It sims the slate out 40,000 times, helps you identify which lineups are the best of the ones that you have built. And then also, don't forget, leave a comment below which fighter wins the main event and how many fantasy points they score. I'm going to pick one person who is closest to the correct answer. Let's give them a free Odd Shopper subscription. That's our betting site. Thank you guys very much for watching. Good luck. See you back here next week.